the streets, battlefields, and hospital wards of 18th century France, a young man named Tarrare became a living contradiction, a body without limits in a society obsessed with order, rationing, and control. Known for an appetite so extreme that it unsettled soldiers, physicians, and aristocrats alike, he was not merely a curiosity, he was a mirror. Explores Tarrare's life not as a grotesque anecdote, but as a psychological, medical, and cultural case study inside a France trembling toward revolution. His hunger becomes a lens through which we examine power, spectacle, medicine, myth, and the fragile line between science and superstition. Because in the end, Tarrare's story asks something far larger. What happens when a body refuses to obey the rules society depends on? It's 1792, a military hospital in eastern France. A group of surgeons stand around a young man who has just eaten an entire meal meant for 15 soldiers. And he is still hungry. And this is not the strangest part. It's the early 1790s, and you're standing inside a drafty military hospital near Sault-au-Rhin. The air smells of boiled cabbage and damp wool uniforms. Candlelight trembles against the whitewashed stone walls. You hear boots scuff against the floorboards. Low murmurs, a cough from the far end of the ward. In the center of the room sits a thin young man. His frame is slight, almost fragile, but his stomach is distended. Moments ago, he consumed several pounds of beef, loaves of bread, and large quantities of wine. Rations calculated carefully under wartime scarcity. The other soldiers stare. Some laugh nervously. Some look unsettled. One physician leans forward, not with disgust, but with curiosity. The man's name is Tarrare, and no one can explain him. If you're new here, consider subscribing, because this isn't just a story about one man's appetite. It's about an entire society trying and failing to understand what it's seeing. And here's the unsettling part. France, at this moment, is starving. To understand Tarrare, we understand 18th century France. In the 1770s and 1780s, bread was not a side dish, it was survival. In many regions, up to 70 to 80% of a working person's calories came from bread alone. Grain shortages were political events. A failed harvest could mean riots. In 1775, the so-called Flour War saw uprisings across northern France over grain prices. Hunger was everywhere, in peasant villages, in urban markets, in whispered resentment toward the monarchy. And into this world of scarcity enters a man who seems incapable of being full. Now picture the psychological tension. When food is precious, moderation is moral. Self-control is virtue. Excess is suspicious. Tarrare doesn't just violate biology, he violates culture. And that matters, because a society reveals itself by how it treats the body it cannot explain. But here's where it gets complicated. Tarrare was not described as obese. In fact, records suggest he remained unusually thin despite his consumption. According to accounts later written by military surgeon Pierre-François Percy, Tarrare could eat enormous quantities without gaining weight. Some reports, though historians debate their exaggeration, describe him consuming offal, scraps, even non-food objects during exhibitions. We must tread carefully. 18th century medical writing often blended observation with sensationalism. Still, multiple physicians documented his appetite. This was not a tavern rumor. It was a medical puzzle. If Tarrare lived today, he might become a viral phenomenon, a competitive eating champion, a TikTok anomaly, a headline engineered for clicks. But in 1792, there was no algorithm. There was only rumor and fear. In an era without metabolic science, extreme appetite could signal imbalance of humors, nervous disorder, even moral failing. Today we medicalize difference. Then they moralized it. That shift tells us more about us than about him. Let's ground ourselves. Tarrare is believed to have been born around 1772 near Lyon, France, though exact records are sparse. By the time of the French Revolutionary Wars, beginning 1792, he had joined the French army. Military documentation places him under observation by doctors in eastern France, particularly around the region of Alsace. The name most associated with his case is Surgeon Pierre-François Percy, who later recorded details of Tarrare's appetite and physical condition. Some specifics vary between sources, but the core fact remains. Multiple medical observers found him extraordinary enough to document, and that means something. So here's where we are. France is unstable, bread is political, revolution is unfolding, and in a military ward, a thin young man consumes enough food to feed a squadron and remains hungry. Doctors stare, soldiers whisper, and no one yet understands what this means. But Tarrare was not born in a hospital. He did not begin as a medical mystery. He began as a child in rural France, and the first people forced to confront his appetite were not surgeons. They were his parents. A wooden table, 3 loaves of bread cooling in the dim light of a farmhouse window. A small boy reaches for one, then another, then the third. By nightfall, they are gone, and the family has nothing left. It's around 1780, in the countryside near Lyon. You're standing in a modest farmhouse. Rough timber beams overhead, packed earth floor beneath your boots. The air smells of smoke and damp hay. Outside, wind brushes through fields of wheat that may or may not survive the season. Inside, dinner is simple. Dark bread, thin soup. Perhaps a scrap of salted meat if the week has been generous. The family gathers around the table. There are no surplus plates, no hidden reserves. Every portion is measured by necessity. Across from you sits a boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. He eats quickly. Too quickly. He finishes his share, then reaches for another's, then another. At first, it's dismissed as childish appetite, but it doesn't stop. By adolescence, local accounts suggest he could consume quantities equal to a quarter of a cow in a single day. Though historians debate such figures and caution that exaggeration often followed him, still, one consistent detail remains. His family could not afford to feed him. In rural 18th century France, that wasn't merely inconvenient, it was catastrophic. To understand the weight of that burden, we need to step back. In pre-revolutionary France, peasant families lived on narrow margins. Harvest yields were vulnerable to frost, pests, taxation, and ties to the church. Under the Ancien Régime, peasants owed dues to local seigneurs. They paid taxes to the crown. They tithed to the church. Food was not just sustenance, it was currency, security, stability. A household survival depended on predictable consumption. And here's what most people miss. Moderation was not simply polite behavior. It was a survival strategy. A child who consumed disproportionately threatened the entire unit. In that world, there was no social safety net, no welfare, no nutritional science. If one body consumed too much, the others went without. So when sources state that Tarrare's parents eventually forced him to leave home as a teenager because they could not sustain him, whether around age 12 or slightly older, it is less cruelty than arithmetic. And this is where history shifts. We tend to view abandonment as moral failure. But in a subsistence economy, morality bends under hunger. And here's where it gets complicated. Was Tarrare's appetite truly beyond biology from the start? Or did the legend grow with time? Early records are thin. Most detailed accounts come later, when he was already known as a curiosity. Historians debate how much of his childhood behavior was retroactively dramatized to fit the myth. But even if we strip away exaggeration, one truth remains. He was hungry enough to destabilize his own family. And that says something profound. A society reveals itself by how it treats the body it cannot explain. In rural France, the solution was exile. Today, a child with extreme appetite might undergo metabolic testing. Doctors would investigate thyroid disorders, genetic syndromes, hormonal imbalance. Parents might join online support groups. But in 1780, there was no diagnostic language for metabolic anomaly. There was only interpretation. Was he gluttonous, possessed, undisciplined, cursed? In a deeply Catholic society, bodily irregularity could easily blur into moral suspicion. Not formally accused, not condemned by church decree, but whispered about. And whispers carry weight. In some ways, it mirrors modern, viral culture. Before understanding arrives, narrative rushes in. Speculation fills the vacuum. And once a story takes hold, it becomes hard to reverse. We know that Tarrare likely left home in his early teens, sometime in the mid to late 1780s. France at this time was already strained financially. The Crown's debt, worsened by support of the American Revolutionary War, placed immense pressure on taxation. Bad harvests in 1788 would soon intensify bread shortages dramatically. But even before that crisis, rural life was precarious. Lyon, the nearest major city, was a center of silk production and trade. It also housed marketplaces where performers, beggars, laborers, and wanderers gathered. A teenage boy with no home, no trade, and a relentless appetite would not last long without adapting. So Tarrare did what many displaced youths did in that era. He turned himself into spectacle. So now we have the outline of his early life. Born around 1772 near Lyon. Raised in a fragile peasant economy, displaying an appetite that strained family survival. Forced to leave home. Alone, adolescent, and perpetually hungry in a country where hunger defined everything. And here's the key. When society could not absorb him quietly, it absorbed him publicly. Because the streets of France in the late 1780s offered one thing to the desperate, an audience. And Tarrare was about to discover that his hunger could draw a crowd. A crowd forms in a Lyon marketplace. Coins clink into a wooden bowl. A teenage boy steps forward. Someone hands him a basket of apples. He doesn't eat one. He eats all of them. And the crowd leans closer. It's 1788. You're standing in a public square near Lyon. Cobblestones damp from morning rain, the smell of livestock and wood smoke hanging low in the air. Merchants shout prices for bread. A fiddler plays near a tavern doorway. Children weave between adults carrying baskets of onions and grain. And there, slightly off-center, a small ring of people begins to form. In the middle stands a thin adolescent boy. His clothes are worn but theatrical in their looseness, sleeves rolled, collar open. Beside him, a crate. Inside the crate, scraps of meat, raw vegetables, discarded bones, perhaps even objects not meant to be eaten. The murmuring begins. A man tosses him a cabbage. He devours it. Someone offers a handful of stones. Whether in jest or experiment, he places them in his mouth. The crowd gasps. You hear laughter, then something else. Not admiration, unease. Because this is not strength, it's something stranger. This boy is Tarrare, and he has discovered something critical. In a society obsessed with survival, extremity sells. Street performance in late 18th century France was not marginal. It was economic survival. Before cinema, before newspapers reached the illiterate majority, before radio, public squares were theatres. Acrobats, animal handlers, illusionists, and strongmen all competed for coin. Curiosity was currency, and the more unusual the act, the larger the crowd. Now picture the psychology of the audience. France in 1788 was trembling. Harvest failures had driven bread prices upward. Political tension between the monarchy and reformers was escalating. Uncertainty hovered in the air. In unstable times, people gather around spectacle. It offers distraction. It offers communal experience. It offers something extraordinary in a life of repetition. Tarrare's hunger became performance because performance was one of the few markets available to someone without property or trade. And here's what most people miss. The crowd wasn't merely entertained. They were negotiating fear. If one man could consume endlessly and still live, perhaps scarcity itself could be mocked. Perhaps hunger could be controlled, or at least laughed at. But here's where it gets complicated. Performance exaggerates. The more coins dropped into the bowl, the more extreme the act became. Later, medical accounts claim Tarrare could consume live animals during exhibitions. Some historians urge caution, noting that such claims may have been amplified by later retellings eager to dramatize. What we can say responsibly is this. He consumed large quantities of food in public settings. He gained notoriety, and notoriety alters identity. When a crowd expects extremity, moderation becomes failure. The body becomes brand. And once that transformation happens, stepping back is almost impossible. If this feels familiar, it should. Today, algorithms reward escalation. A viral challenge must outdo the last one. An influencer must push boundaries to remain visible. Tarrare's 18th century marketplace was not digital, but the incentive structure was strikingly similar. Attention required amplification. The crowd shaped the act, and the act shaped the man. Except in Tarrare's case, the currency wasn't followers, it was survival. By 1788 and 1789, France's crisis intensified. The Estates General would convene in May 1789, the first time since 1614, in response to financial collapse. Within months, the storming of the Bastille would signal revolutionary transformation. Amid these seismic political events, Tarrare remained a minor curiosity. But that's precisely what makes him powerful as a lens. While philosophers debated sovereignty, ordinary people gathered around a boy who could eat anything. Both are expressions of instability. Both are reactions to scarcity, one political, one bodily, and neither fully understood. So here's where we stand. A rural child becomes an exile becomes a performer becomes a spectacle. France edges toward revolution. Bread grows scarce, crowds grow restless, And Tarrare's hunger becomes not just biological, but theatrical. But performance has limits. Because crowds disperse, markets close, winter arrives. And spectacle does not guarantee stability. In 1789, revolution ignites. By 1792, France is at war. And Tarrare, still hungry, will find himself in an institution far more structured than a marketplace. The army, where excess is no longer amusing. A baker's shop in Paris. The shelves are empty. A woman pounds on the counter demanding bread. Outside, a crowd swells. And somewhere not far away, a young man who can eat without limit is still searching for his next meal. It's October 1789. You're standing in a narrow Paris street before dawn. The sky is grey-blue. Cold air presses against your lungs. The smell of wet stone and unbaked flour drifts from shuttered bakeries. Around you, women gather, shawls tight around their shoulders, hands rough from labour. They murmur about rising bread prices, about rumours, about betrayal. Then the murmuring sharpens. À Versailles. The Women's March on Versailles is about to begin. They will demand bread. They will demand accountability. They will force the royal family back to Paris. This is not just political unrest. It is hunger weaponized. And in this moment, France reveals its central truth. Bread is power. Now picture Tarrare somewhere in this same country, perhaps in Lyon, perhaps already drifting eastward. His appetite is not metaphorical, it is literal. And yet, it exists inside a nation where millions are calculating crumbs. That contrast is explosive. By 1788 to 1789, France faced severe harvest failures. Grain shortages pushed bread prices to extraordinary levels. In some regions, the cost of bread consumed over half a worker's daily wage. Under the Ancien Régime, the monarchy's legitimacy was tied to stability, especially food supply. When that stability faltered, trust eroded. The Estates General convened in May 1789. By July, the Bastille had fallen. By 1791, the monarchy's power was sharply reduced. And by 1792, France would declare war on Austria and Prussia. This is the environment into which Tarrare steps as a young adult. War changes everything, especially food. Rations become calculated, supplies are centralized, bodies are regulated. In peacetime, a man who eats too much is curious. In wartime, he is a logistical problem. And here's where it gets complicated. Revolution promised equality, but war demanded efficiency. When France declared war in April 1792, the revolutionary government mobilized mass armies. Soldiers were issued rations based on strict measurement: bread, meat, wine. Every ounce counted. So when Tarrare joined the French army, likely around 1792, his appetite collided with bureaucracy. He reportedly consumed his own rations quickly, then scavenged from refuse piles, then begged from fellow soldiers. Accounts describe him eating discarded scraps behind kitchens, not out of spectacle, out of need. And in a regiment where supply lines already strained under pressure, this was not sustainable. The army is not a marketplace. It does not reward excess. It punishes imbalance. Think of a modern corporation during crisis. When profits drop, expenses are scrutinized. Every department is audited. Now imagine one employee consuming 10 times the allocated budget, even if they are not malicious, even if they cannot help it. The system reacts, not emotionally, structurally. The French Revolutionary Army was no different. It did not see Tarrare as a tragic anomaly. It saw a supply disruption, and institutions are rarely patient with disruption. In 1792, France entered the War of the First Coalition. Battles in eastern regions like Alsace placed enormous pressure on local military infrastructure. Tarrare's presence is later documented in this theatre of war. Surgeon Pierre-François Percy, then serving as a military doctor, would eventually describe Tarrare's condition in medical memoirs published years later. According to these accounts, Tarrare was admitted to military hospital care because his hunger could not be managed within standard rationing systems. Sources differ on exact quantities he consumed, but they agree on the central problem. The army could not ignore him, and once doctors become involved, spectacle transforms into experiment. So let's pause. France is revolutionary. France is at war. Bread is rationed. The state is reorganizing power. And within this tightening system stands a thin soldier who cannot stop eating. In peasant life, he was a burden. In the marketplace, he was an attraction. In the army, he becomes something else entirely. A case. And cases attract curiosity, because when military physicians first examined Tarrare, they did not simply see a problem. They saw potential, and soon his hunger would be tested, not for entertainment, but for science. A wooden table inside a military hospital. On it, a meal meant for 15 men. Bread, meat, wine. Across the room, officers watch in silence. The young soldier begins to eat. They are not laughing anymore. They are measuring. It's 1792, eastern France. You're inside a military hospital near Soultz-au-Rhin, close to the volatile frontier with Prussia. The room is long and narrow. Rows of cots line the walls. The scent of boiled broth mixes with antiseptic herbs and damp wool. Outside, war moves in distant formations. Boots in mud, muskets stacked, drums calling men to readiness. Inside, something stranger unfolds. Tarrare sits at the center of the ward. He looks almost underfed. His limbs are thin, his face slack in a way that physicians later describe as apathetic when not eating. Before him, a pile of food, carefully weighed. This is not a tavern stunt. This is observation. You hear quills scratching into notebooks. He eats quickly, efficiently. Bread disappears, meat vanishes, wine drains. The doctors lean closer. They note something unsettling. His pulse remains steady. He shows no visible discomfort. And when the meal is gone, he asks for more. Military medicine in the late 18th century was in transition. The Enlightenment had encouraged observation, documentation, categorization. But modern physiology did not yet exist. Digestion was still interpreted through remnants of humoral theory. Balance of bodily fluids, nervous energy, internal heat. Doctors did not understand metabolism. They did not understand endocrine systems. But they did understand anomaly. And anomaly demanded classification. Surgeon Pierre-François Percy, who would later write about Tarrare, was not a carnival showman. He was a respected military physician. When someone like Percy documents a case, it signals seriousness. Tarrare's appetite moved from rumor into medical curiosity. And this is where history shifts again. Because once the state takes interest in a body, that body becomes resource. And here's where it gets complicated. War creates urgency. Urgency accelerates experimentation. According to later accounts, Physicians tested Tarrare's capacity under controlled conditions. They reportedly fed him extraordinary quantities, entire meals intended for multiple soldiers. Some sources claim he consumed a live cat in front of observers, though historians debate the reliability of such details and caution against uncritical repetition. What we can say responsibly is this: he ate far beyond normal limits. He remained thin, and doctors could not explain why. In wartime, unexplained capacity is not merely curious. It is strategic, because armies are always looking for advantage. And someone, we don't know precisely who first suggested it, began to see Tarrare not as a burden, but as a tool. In times of crisis, institutions repurpose anomaly. Think of how modern tech companies, during wartime or emergency, redirect engineers to defense contracts, or how startups pivot their entire business model to survive market collapse. The logic is simple. If something is unusual, ask how it can be useful. The French Revolutionary Army, fighting coalition forces, was desperate for intelligence. Communication across enemy lines was dangerous. Captured couriers were executed. But what if a message could not be easily found? What if it could be swallowed? Tarrare's hunger suddenly looked like infrastructure. By late 1792, France was engaged in active campaigns along the Rhine. Alsace was a key theatre. According to Percy's later memoirs, Tarrare was hospitalized in this region after failing to sustain himself on standard rations. It is here, in eastern France during the War of the First Coalition, that the idea reportedly emerged: use Tarrare as a courier. The plan was deceptively simple. A message would be placed inside a small wooden box. He would swallow it, cross into enemy territory under the guise of a peasant, deliver the message once it passed naturally. It was experimental, risky, and revealing, because it shows us something profound. The revolutionary government, born in ideals of liberty and rights, was willing to instrumentalize a man's body in ways that blurred ethical lines. A society reveals itself by how it treats the body it cannot explain. Now Tarrare's body was no longer spectacle. It was strategy. So let's take stock. France is a war. A young soldier with an impossible appetite is placed under medical observation. Doctors confirm the anomaly. And in the crucible of revolution and conflict, his hunger transforms from inconvenience into potential weapon. The army, desperate and innovative, prepares to test a theory. Can a man become a living envelope? Soon, Tarrare will cross into enemy territory, not as a warrior, not as a spy in disguise, but as a courier carrying secrets inside his own body. And the experiment will not unfold as planned. A small wooden box, no larger than a walnut. A folded note sealed inside. A young soldier lifts it to his mouth. Officers watch. This is not desperation. This is policy. It's late 1792, near the Rhine frontier. You're standing in a dim military chamber lit by 2 flickering candles. Outside, wind presses against shuttered windows. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thunders faintly, a reminder that France is no longer arguing about sovereignty, it is fighting for it. Around a rough wooden table stand officers and surgeons. The mood is measured, deliberate. On the table lies a small wooden case, smooth and cylindrical. Inside it, a handwritten message. The plan is explained quietly. The soldier, Tarrare, will swallow the container. He will cross into Prussian-held territory posing as a peasant. Once inside, He will retrieve the message and deliver it to a French contact. You can feel the tension in the room, not fear, calculation, because this is revolutionary warfare. Inventive, improvised, relentless. Tarrare stands thin and expressionless. When handed the box, he does not hesitate. He swallows. And just like that, a human body becomes courier infrastructure. The War of the First Coalition placed France against Austria, Prussia, and other European powers determined to contain revolutionary upheaval. Espionage was constant. Information about troop movement, morale, and supply routes could shift entire campaigns. Traditional couriers were vulnerable. Letters could be intercepted. Messengers could be searched. So concealment became innovation. Swallowing messages was not entirely unprecedented. Smugglers and spies had used bodily concealment before, but using a soldier specifically because of his abnormal digestive capacity. That was new and revealing, because it tells us how revolutionary France understood utility. The revolution proclaimed universal rights, yet wartime necessity carved exceptions. If Tarrare could digest anything, why not transform that ability into advantage? Here's what most people miss. In revolutionary France, the body itself became political territory. Bodies marched, bodies starved, bodies were executed, and here a body became strategy. And here's where it gets complicated. There is debate among historians about how formal this mission truly was. Some accounts suggest it was an experimental test, not a mission carrying sensitive intelligence. Perhaps the message was intentionally trivial, designed to see whether Tarrare could complete the journey undetected. If so, that detail changes the psychology, because it would mean the army itself doubted the plan. Either way, the risk was real. If captured, Tarrare would face interrogation, and if the message were discovered, the consequences would be severe. But war compresses ethical reflection. Urgency overrides hesitation. Think of modern intelligence agencies testing unconventional tools, cyber exploits, behavioral experiments, psychological operations. Often, the first deployment is less about success and more about feasibility. Can it be done? Tarrare's mission appears to have carried that experimental quality. He was not yet a trusted asset. He was proof of concept. In startup language, he was a beta test. Except the stakes were life and death. And so the mission proceeds. According to later accounts by Pierre-François Percy, Tarrare was sent across the Rhine toward Prussian lines in late 1792 or early 1793. The region was heavily militarized. Language barriers were significant. Tarrare reportedly did not speak German fluently, which would prove critical. Disguised as a peasant, he attempted to pass through enemy territory, but he aroused suspicion. Captured by Prussian forces, he was reportedly detained and searched. When no letter was found externally, suspicion deepened. He was held, watched, and eventually, as the story goes, forced to wait under guard until the swallowed container passed naturally. When it did, the wooden box was recovered. The message inside, according to Percy's account, contained little strategic value, suggesting the mission was indeed a test. Historians debate the full accuracy of these details, but the core narrative remains consistent. The experiment failed, and Tarrare returned, humiliated, frightened, and changed. So here's what has happened. A starving nation weaponizes a starving body. A young man becomes a living courier. He crosses into enemy territory. He is captured. The message is recovered. The mission accomplishes little, and the illusion of clever innovation gives way to a harsher reality. Tarrare is not invulnerable. He is vulnerable in ways the officers had not fully calculated. When he returned to French lines, something had shifted. The doctors no longer saw just potential. They saw instability, and soon Tarrare's hunger would grow darker, unsettling even those who once found it useful. A hospital corridor at night. Footsteps echo. A door creaks open. Inside, a patient is awake, not screaming, not raving, just searching for something to eat. It's 1793. You're standing in a military hospital ward in eastern France. The revolution has intensified. The king has been executed in January. Europe is watching. Enemies surround the Republic. Inside this hospital, the mood is quieter, but no less tense. Cots line the walls. Bandaged soldiers shift in uneasy sleep. A faint odor lingers. Sweat, iron, boiled broth, damp straw. In the corner bed sits Tarrare. By now, the failed courier experiment has marked him. He is no longer an amusing curiosity. He is a problem under observation. Doctors approach with clinical detachment. They examine his abdomen. They note the looseness of his skin, described in later accounts as hanging folds when empty, stretching when filled. They observe his constant hunger. And here's what unsettles them. Even after enormous meals, he claims he is still starving. Not craving, starving. You hear the scratch of pen against paper. They are trying to translate mystery into language. To understand their reaction, we have to understand 18th century medicine. This is an era in transition. The Enlightenment encouraged empirical observation. Write what you see, measure what you can. But physiology remained deeply limited. The dominant medical framework still carried echoes of humoral theory. Balance between blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Digestion was thought to involve internal heat, a kind of bodily furnace. If someone consumed enormous quantities, perhaps their internal fire burned hotter. Perhaps their nerves were overstimulated. Perhaps their stomach was abnormally elastic. Without metabolic science, doctors could only describe effects, not causes. And so Tarrare became a specimen of curiosity, not mocked, not fully pitied, studied, which feels progressive, but also unsettling. Because observation can slide into experimentation, and experimentation without ethical framework can slide further. A society reveals itself by how it treats the body it cannot explain. And here's where it gets complicated. Accounts from Percy and others describe increasingly disturbing behavior. When food was scarce, Tarrare reportedly scavenged from refuse heaps. He sought scraps from hospital kitchens. Some sources, again debated, suggest he consumed inedible objects during moments of desperation. We must tread carefully. 18th century medical writing sometimes amplified abnormality to heighten drama or underscore professional authority. But multiple observers agree on one pattern. When deprived of food, Tarrare became restless, agitated, desperate. And that desperation changed how staff viewed him. Curiosity shifted toward caution, because hunger that cannot be satisfied begins to look less like anomaly and more like threat. Consider how modern medicine handles extreme cases today. When a rare disorder emerges, it draws research, funding, conferences, journal articles. There is fascination, but also strict ethical review boards, informed consent protocols, institutional oversight. In 1793, Those guardrails barely existed. Hospitals were experimental by necessity. Surgeons learned by doing. War accelerated risk-taking. In that environment, Tarrare's body became a living laboratory. Not maliciously, but structurally. When knowledge is incomplete, the body becomes the site of trial and error. By 1793, France had entered the Reign of Terror. Political paranoia surged. Internal enemies were feared as much as foreign ones. Committees of public safety oversaw state security. Suspicion was cultural currency. Within this broader climate, a soldier who behaved unpredictably, who prowled hospital grounds in search of scraps, attracted unease. According to later medical writings, Tarrare was eventually admitted for more sustained observation in a military hospital in Sault-Saurane. Doctors attempted controlled feeding regimens. They monitored his appetite. They documented his physical condition. But they did not find answers. And as revolutionary France radicalized, tolerance for instability shrank. So let's gather the threads. Tarrare's body has moved through stages: burden, spectacle, tool, specimen. Doctors observe but cannot diagnose. War intensifies pressure. Political paranoia saturates the culture. And his hunger, once merely astonishing, now begins to feel dangerous. Not because of what it is, but because of what it represents. Loss of control. Soon, an incident, part rumor, part record, will push fear to the forefront. And Tarrare's presence in the hospital will no longer feel merely inconvenient. It will feel intolerable. A child is missing. A hospital corridor hums with whispers. Eyes turn slowly toward one man, and no one says the accusation out loud, but everyone thinks it. It's 1793 or early 1794. You're standing inside the courtyard of a military hospital in eastern France. The sky is overcast, cold, still. A small group of orderlies cluster near a doorway. Their voices are low, tight. Somewhere inside the building, a child, reportedly the young son of a staff member, cannot be found. Searches begin. Rooms are checked, storage areas opened, basement corridors examined. You can feel the tension. This is revolutionary France. Trust is thin. Fear is ambient. And in this charged silence, attention drifts, not logically, but emotionally, toward Tarrare. The man who eats anything. The man who prowls refuse piles. The man no one understands. No official accusation is recorded. No formal charge appears in medical notes. But later accounts claim suspicion fell heavily on him. And whether the rumor was justified or not, it reveals something essential. When a society is frightened, the inexplicable becomes a target. We must move carefully here. The story that Tarrare was suspected in the disappearance of a child appears in later retellings of his life, particularly in medical memoirs written after his death. There is no surviving court record confirming a formal investigation, no documented trial. Historians debate how literal this episode was. It may have been rumor. It may have been exaggerated to underscore how disturbing his behavior appeared to contemporaries. But even if the event was partly shaped by narrative embellishment, its inclusion in early accounts tells us something about the climate. In 1793 to 1794, France was deep in the Reign of Terror. Executions were frequent. Suspicion was cultural oxygen. Deviation, political, moral, physical, was dangerous. And Tarrare deviated visibly. A society reveals itself by how it treats the body it cannot explain. In a time of paranoia, explanation becomes secondary to containment. And here's where it gets complicated. Even if Tarrare had nothing to do with the missing child, and there is no solid evidence that he did, the mere plausibility of suspicion changed his position. He was no longer just a curiosity under medical care. He was a potential liability. Hospital staff reportedly grew increasingly uncomfortable. Some accounts describe him being dismissed or expelled from care after trust deteriorated. Imagine his psychological position: hungry beyond reason, dependent on institutions for food, now distrusted by the very people studying him. Isolation compounds anomaly, and anomaly under suspicion becomes exile once more. Think about how quickly modern public opinion turns when someone is already perceived as strange. A viral rumor, a clipped video without context, a narrative fills in the blanks. Even if later disproven, the damage lingers. Reputation shifts faster than facts. In 18th century France, there was no internet, but there was gossip. And gossip in closed institutions can be just as powerful. Once suspicion attaches to a person already seen as abnormal, it rarely loosens easily. By 1794, the Reign of Terror was nearing its peak. Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety intensified purges. Fear of internal enemies defined the political atmosphere. Within that context, Tarrare reportedly left the military hospital. Some accounts suggest he was expelled. Others imply he left voluntarily after realizing he would never be trusted again. Precise documentation is thin, but what is clear is this: his structured period under military observation ended, and he returned to civilian life, still hungry, still unexplained, and now carrying the weight of suspicion. So here we are, a failed espionage experiment, doctors unable to diagnose, rumors swirling, a missing child, trust fractured, the revolutionary state growing harsher by the month. Tarrare exits the hospital not as a medical marvel, not as a hero, but as a man shadowed by unease. And in revolutionary France, unease is dangerous currency, but his story does not end in exile, because within a few years, illness will drive him back into the care of physicians, and this time, the experiment will not be about strategy. It will be about survival. A knock at a physician's door. It's 1798. The revolution has devoured many of its own, and outside stands a man who once swallowed secrets for the Republic. He is thinner now, sicker, still hungry. It's the winter of 1798. You're standing in a modest medical office in Versailles. The terror has ended. Robespierre is gone. France is now under the Directory, politically unstable, but no longer in mass execution mode. The room smells of ink and drying herbs. On a wooden desk lies parchment, folded correspondence, anatomical sketches. A physician looks up as the door opens. In steps a familiar figure, Tarrare. He appears weakened, his skin pale, his frame slacker than before. Accounts suggest he sought out medical attention because he believed he was dying. Imagine the silence in that room. Years earlier, he had been a wartime curiosity. Now he returns not as spectacle, but as supplicant. He tells the doctor he has been ill for months, exhausted, still plagued by insatiable hunger. But now, something else is wrong. And here's what makes this moment heavy. The man once studied for his abnormal vitality now fears collapse. By 1798, France had shifted politically. The Directory governed after the fall of the Terror in 1794. War continued abroad, But internal executions had slowed. Society was recalibrating. Medicine, too, was evolving. Post-revolutionary France placed growing emphasis on clinical observation and hospital-based study. Paris, in particular, would soon become a center of modern medical reform. But in 1798, diagnostic tools were still limited. No blood tests, no imaging, no endocrine knowledge. If a patient presented with chronic illness, doctors relied on physical examination and symptom description. According to later accounts, again primarily from Percy and contemporaries, Tarrare complained of severe weakness and possibly abdominal pain. He reportedly believed a golden fork he had once swallowed during an exhibition was lodged inside him. That detail may sound absurd, but remember, without internal imaging, swallowed objects were genuine medical concerns, and Tarrare's history made such a claim plausible. And here's where it gets complicated. Doctors examined him. They did not find a fork, but they did find signs of severe illness. Descriptions from later memoirs mention chronic diarrhea, weakness, and what may have been symptoms of tuberculosis or another wasting disease. We must be cautious. Retrospective diagnosis across centuries is speculative. Historians debate whether he suffered from hypothyroidism, a metabolic disorder, psychological compulsion, or an undiagnosed genetic condition. But here is what we know. His body, once defined by relentless appetite, was now deteriorating, and the institution that once tried to use him now faced a different question. Can he be saved? In modern culture, we often celebrate extremes while they entertain us. Competitive eaters, extreme athletes, reality television personalities who push boundaries. But when the camera turns off, when illness sets in, the fascination fades. Institutions pivot from spotlight to paperwork. Tarrare's arc mirrors that pattern. At his peak anomaly, he was useful. At his weakest, he was simply a patient. And systems are rarely designed to cherish patients. They manage them. The year 1798 places us firmly in post-terror France. Napoleon Bonaparte would soon rise to prominence through campaigns in Italy and Egypt. The revolution was mutating into empire. Meanwhile, Tarrare was admitted to a hospital in Versailles, where Percy later reported overseeing aspects of his care. According to those accounts, his condition worsened rapidly. Within months, he was bedridden. He remained hungry, but his strength was gone, and physicians prepared for an outcome they could not prevent. So let's gather the arc. A rural child driven from home, a street performer fueled by extremity, a soldier turned experimental courier, a suspected anomaly in paranoid times, now a sick man returning to medical care, his hunger unchanged, his body failing, and doctors once again watching, pens ready. Because in death, answers sometimes appear that life conceals. Soon, Tarrare will die, and what physicians find inside his body will both clarify and deepen the mystery. A quiet room, morning light through tall windows, a covered body on a wooden table. Physicians gather. For years they watched him eat. Now they will look inside. It's 1798, Versailles. You stand in a clinical chamber. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just practical. The air smells faintly of vinegar and iron. Windows are cracked open despite the chill, an attempt at ventilation. On the table lies Tarrare, thin, still. The restlessness that once defined him has gone silent. Around the table, surgeons prepare instruments, metal reflecting pale daylight. There is no spectacle here, No crowd, just inquiry. For years they documented what went in. Now they will discover what remained. Outside, France moves forward, politically unstable, militarily ambitious. Inside, a question lingers. Was there something physically different inside this man? Or was the mystery destined to remain mystery? Autopsies in the late 18th century were becoming more common in medical circles, especially in France, where clinical observation was increasingly valued. Paris and Versailles were early centers of anatomical study. Physicians believed that disease left visible traces. If the living body confused them, the dead body might clarify. According to Percy's later memoirs, Tarrare's autopsy revealed abnormalities. Descriptions include an unusually large esophagus, a stomach reportedly distended and capable of significant expansion, ulcerations and signs of internal disease. Some accounts claim his internal organs emitted a strong odor and that his body showed signs of advanced tuberculosis. Historians caution that these descriptions may reflect both genuine pathology and the narrative style of 18th century medical writing, which often dramatized unusual cases. Still, one conclusion seemed clear to observers at the time. He was not simply gluttonous. Something in his anatomy was different, but not different enough to explain everything. And here's where it gets complicated. Even with direct anatomical observation, physicians did not find a single definitive cause. No obvious obstruction, no mechanical explanation that justified the full extremity of his appetite. The autopsy provided clues, not answers. And that ambiguity matters, because it reveals the limits of Enlightenment confidence. This was an era that believed reason could decode the world, measure it, classify it, name it. Yet here lay a body that resisted neat categorization. The more they looked, the less certain they became. A society reveals itself by how it treats the body it cannot explain. In life, they experimented. In death, they dissected. But certainty remained elusive. Today, if a case like Tarrare's appeared, it would likely trigger genetic sequencing, endocrine panels, neurological scans. Teams of specialists would convene. Medical journals would publish hypotheses within months. But even now, rare disorders sometimes defy immediate explanation. Medicine advances by confronting anomaly. Tarrare's tragedy was timing. He lived in a century curious enough to observe him, but not advanced enough to understand him. He existed in the gap between superstition and science. And gaps are uncomfortable places to live. Tarrare died in 1798, reportedly around the age of 26. The primary detailed account of his life and autopsy comes from Pierre-François Percy, who later included the case in medical writings. These records describe pathological findings but stop short of a definitive diagnosis. Modern historians and medical scholars have speculated. Hyperthyroidism, Prader-Willi syndrome, a hypothalamic disorder, severe metabolic dysfunction. But these remain retrospective hypotheses. No preserved tissue samples exist, no laboratory confirmation. What remains is text. And text carries both insight and bias. So here is the final image of his physical life. A man defined by hunger, studied by doctors, used by the army, suspected by peers, returning an illness, dying young, opened in search of clarity, and leaving behind a body that answered some questions, but not the central one. Why? In the years that followed, Tarrare's story did not disappear. It transformed, retold, exaggerated, debated, and in that transformation, something revealing happens, not about his body, but about ours. A medical manuscript lies open on a desk, ink slightly faded. A physician's careful handwriting describes a man who could eat anything. The body is gone. The story remains, and stories change. It's the early 19th century. You're inside a quiet study in France. Napoleon has risen. Europe is reshaping itself again. On a wooden desk rests a bound volume of medical memoirs. Candlelight flickers across the page. A physician, older now, revisits cases from his career, among them Tarrare. He writes not as a showman, but as a clinician recounting anomaly. Still, you can sense something in the prose, fascination, even disbelief. He describes the insatiable appetite, the failed espionage mission, the hospital experiments, the autopsy findings. Outside, France has moved on. But within these pages, Tarrare remains suspended, eternally hungry. And here's what changes in this moment. The living patient becomes narrative. Once a person's story enters text, it leaves the realm of private memory. It becomes portable, reproducible, expandable. Pierre-François Percy's writings ensured Tarrare would not vanish into obscurity. Other physicians reference the case. Later compendiums of medical oddities included him. By the 19th century, Europe had a growing appetite for cases, documented extremes of the human body. Anomalies fascinated readers of medical journals and popular pamphlets alike. But here's the subtle shift. With each retelling, detail can sharpen or blur. Numbers grow larger, behaviors grow stranger. What began as clinical observation risks becoming legend. Historians debate specific claims, especially the more dramatic elements. Precisely because documentation is limited to a handful of accounts, no parish records confirm early childhood anecdotes. No military archive preserves the exact text of the swallowed message. What survives is mediated memory, and mediated memory is never neutral. A society reveals itself by how it treats the body it cannot explain, but it also reveals itself by how it retells that body's story. And here's where it gets complicated. The 19th century saw the rise of medical exhibition culture, anatomical museums, traveling displays of preserved organs, catalogues of deformities. The line between science and spectacle thinned again. Tarrare's case sat uncomfortably at that intersection. Was he a clinical lesson, a cautionary tale, an entertainment curiosity? Each era answered differently, and each answer tells us more about that era than about him. Think about how documentaries, podcasts, and online platforms handle unusual historical figures today. A single thread can become a viral narrative. Top 10 strangest people in history, clipped anecdotes, amplified shock, context compressed. Even now, Tarrare is often reduced to headlines. The man who ate everything, but reduction flattens complexity. His life unfolded inside revolution, scarcity, experimental medicine, and institutional pressure. Stripped of context, he becomes caricature. Embedded in context, he becomes lens. And that choice, caricature or lens, reflects our values. Percy's memoirs, published in the early 19th century, remain the primary detailed source of Tarrare's life. Subsequent references in medical literature drew heavily from his account. No independent diary from Tarrare survives, no personal letters, no testimony in his own words. Everything we know passes through observers. That asymmetry matters, because it means Tarrare is preserved almost entirely through institutional perspective, military, medical, administrative. We see him as they saw him. So let's gather the shape of memory. A hungry child becomes a wandering performer. A soldier becomes experiment. A patient becomes autopsy. An autopsy becomes text. A text becomes legend. And over time, the legend risks overshadowing the lived experience. What remains constant is not certainty. It is fascination. But if we move beyond the myth, beyond the shock value, something deeper emerges. Because Tarrare's hunger was not just physical. It unfolded inside a nation defined by scarcity, revolution, and reinvention. And to understand him fully, we must return to the question beneath the spectacle. What was France itself hungry for? We do not see how he saw himself. A breadline stretches down a Paris street. A drumbeat echoes in the distance. Pamphlets change hands. France is devouring its past. Crown, church, calendar, even time itself. And still, it is not satisfied. It's 1794. You're standing in Paris, near the Place de la Révolution. The air is sharp. You hear carts rolling over cobblestones, the murmur of crowds, the low mechanical rhythm of state machinery at work. France has executed its king, redefined citizenship, abolished feudal privileges, rewritten its calendar, renamed streets, reorganized the church. This is not reform. This is consumption. The old order is being dismantled piece by piece, and the appetite for transformation seems endless. Now imagine, somewhere in the East, a man whose body mirrors that rhythm, insatiable, restless, unable to feel full. It would be easy to say this is coincidence, but history rarely moves in isolation. Individual bodies and collective psychology often echo one another. Revolutions are rarely satisfied with moderate change. Once momentum builds, escalation becomes natural. The French Revolution moved from constitutional monarchy, 1791, to republic, 1792, to terror, 1793 to 1794. Each stage justified the next. Security demanded vigilance. Vigilance demanded purges. Purges demanded suspicion. Suspicion fed itself. France devoured aristocratic privilege, then political moderates, then former revolutionaries. The machinery of change expanded beyond its original target. And here's what makes this relevant. Scarcity shaped revolutionary psychology. When bread is uncertain, moderation feels fragile. When power is unstable, control must be asserted visibly. Authority becomes performance. Declarations, festivals, executions, new symbols, everything amplified. In that environment, excess feels almost logical, because stability has already collapsed. A society reveals itself by how it treats the body it cannot explain. Revolutionary France treated Tarrare as an anomaly to be used, managed, studied, then set aside. It treated its own political opponents in similarly instrumental ways. Not identical, but structurally similar. Utility first, human complexity second. And here's where it gets complicated. We must resist the temptation to romanticize metaphor. Tarrare did not cause revolution. Revolution did not cause his appetite. But both emerged in a world defined by imbalance. Food systems strained, political structures fractured, institutions reorganized. When systems are destabilized, extremes surface more visibly. A man like Tarrare might have lived quietly in another century, or perhaps not. But in 1790s France, extremity found audience and documentation. Revolution magnified anomaly, and anomaly reflected revolution. Consider how modern societies behave during crisis. Economic collapse, pandemic, political polarization. Suddenly, rhetoric intensifies. News cycles accelerate. public discourse sharpens. Moderation struggles to hold attention. Extremes dominate headlines. It is not that extremity appears out of nowhere. It becomes more visible, more amplified. The 1790s were France's amplification decade, and Tarrare's body, already unusual, became unforgettable inside that volume. Between 1793 and 1794, approximately 16,000 people were executed during the Reign of Terror by official record, with many more dying in prison. The guillotine became symbol and instrument. Public executions were theatrical, designed to demonstrate state resolve. Meanwhile, rationing intensified in urban centers. Price controls like the law of the maximum attempted to stabilize food costs. The state intervened directly in daily consumption. Food, law, and fear intertwined. Inside this climate, Tarrare's inability to be satisfied carried symbolic weight. Whether anyone consciously articulated it or not, he existed at the edge of a culture, obsessed with controlling intake, political, moral, physical. So here is the widening lens. A man who cannot feel full, a nation that cannot stop transforming, institutions experimenting on bodies, crowds gathering around spectacle, scarcity shaping morality, revolution consuming itself. Tarrare's story is not isolated curiosity. It is threaded into the psychological fabric of his time, and that is why it endures. But there is still one layer left to examine, because beneath revolution, beneath medicine, beneath spectacle, there is the question of the mind. Was Tarrare's hunger purely physical, or was something else driving it? A plate is set down. The man across from it has already eaten twice. He looks at the food not with pleasure, but with urgency, as if something inside him is louder than choice. It's 1793, in a hospital ward at dusk. You're seated near the end of Tarrare's bed. The light is fading. Long orange streaks cutting through the high windows. The ward is quieter now. Most soldiers are asleep or staring blankly at the ceiling. Tarrare sits upright. He has just finished an enormous meal. Measured, observed, documented. And yet his eyes scan the room. Not playfully, not theatrically, restlessly. His breathing is steady. His hands twitch slightly. You can feel something in the air, not menace, not madness, but agitation. He does not seem satisfied. He seems compelled. And that difference matters, because compulsion is not appetite, it is pressure. The 18th century had limited language for psychological conditions. Terms like melancholia and mania existed, but the understanding of behavioral disorders was minimal. Compulsive behavior was often framed as moral weakness or nervous imbalance. If Tarrare experienced something akin to what we might today call a disorder of satiety, a failure in the brain's signaling of fullness, no one in his era could identify it neurologically. The hypothalamus, hormones like leptin and ghrelin, endocrine feedback loops, all unknown. Instead, behavior was interpreted externally. If someone ate excessively, it might be called gluttony. If they seemed driven, it might be called nervous agitation. And yet Percy's description suggests something more complex. He described Tarrare as apathetic when not eating, lethargic, withdrawn, but animated when food appeared. This pattern hints at more than simple indulgence. It suggests dysregulation. Historians and modern medical scholars debate possibilities. Hypothyroidism, which can increase metabolism dramatically. Prader-Willi syndrome, a rare genetic condition associated with insatiable hunger. Hypothalamic injury, severe metabolic disorder, or even trauma-induced behavioral compulsion. But retrospective diagnosis is fragile. We do not have tissue samples. We do not have clinical charts. We have narrative. Still, one thing seems consistent. He did not behave like someone enjoying excess. He behaved like someone chasing relief. And here's where it gets complicated. Compulsion erodes agency. If Tarrare felt constant internal hunger signals, his choices narrow. Imagine living every hour with the sensation most people feel after a day without food, not metaphorically, physiologically. That would alter personality, social interaction, impulse control. In a society already suspicious of deviation, such behavior would isolate quickly. And isolation intensifies distress. It becomes a cycle. Hunger to behavior, to suspicion, to exclusion, to stress, to intensified behavior. Without modern psychological support or medical treatment, there was no interruption point. He lived inside the feedback loop. Today, we are beginning to understand how brain chemistry shapes behavior. Addiction, compulsive disorders, eating disorders. We increasingly frame them as medical conditions rather than moral failures. But stigma still lingers. Public commentary often slides back into judgment. Why don't they just stop? That question ignores neurobiology. In Tarrare's century, there was no such debate. Judgment filled the space where science was absent. His hunger became identity, and identity hardened into narrative. By 1798, when Tarrare sought care in Versailles, he reportedly believed he had swallowed a golden fork during earlier exhibitions, and that it remained inside him. Whether literal or symptomatic of anxiety, the belief indicates distress. He feared something was wrong internally. Doctors found no fork, but they did find disease. He died that same year, around age 26. No record suggests he found relief. No record describes sustained comfort. His life arc is short, compressed between anomaly and illness, and at no point do we hear his own voice explaining what it felt like. So where does that leave us? A biological anomaly, likely real. A psychological burden, almost certain. A revolutionary society unequipped to interpret either. Doctors observing without answers. Institutions using without fully understanding. Rumors amplifying fear. And a young man living in a body that refused to cooperate with the norms around him. This was not simply spectacle. It was suffering inside a system without language for it. But before we close his story, there's one final layer we must examine. Because even after death, even after autopsy, Tarrare's legacy continued to grow. And how we tell his story today says as much about us as it ever did about him. A modern screen glows in the dark. A thumbnail reads, "The man who ate everything." Millions of views, hundreds of comments, shock, jokes, disbelief. 2 centuries later, we are still watching him eat. It's not 1798, it's now. You're sitting in a dim room late at night. Your phone lights your face. You scroll past wars, politics, celebrity drama, and pause on something strange. A historical curiosity, an extreme, a body that defies expectation. Click. The story unfolds quickly. A man in 18th century France who ate cats, stones, enormous meals. Your reaction is immediate. Fascination, revulsion, curiosity, maybe even laughter. But now pause. Imagine instead you are back in that hospital ward in 1793. No thumbnail, no comment section. Just a young man sitting on a cot, hungry beyond explanation. The difference between spectacle and suffering is distance. And distance is what time gives us. In the 19th century, Tarrare's story circulated in medical literature and anecdotal compilations. By the 20th and 21st centuries, it migrated into popular history books, documentaries, and online content. Each era reframed him slightly. Victorian readers saw marvel. Modern audiences see shock value. But here's what matters. Every retelling reveals contemporary priorities. When medicine advanced, Tarrare became a diagnostic in puzzle. When entertainment media expanded, he became a headline. When digital culture accelerated, he became content. A society reveals itself by how it treats the body it cannot explain, but also by how it markets that body afterward. We live in an era that amplifies extremity. Outliers trend, anomalies circulate, and nuance struggles for airtime. So the question becomes, can we tell this story without turning him back into spectacle? And here's where it gets complicated. There is a tension in responsible storytelling. To ignore Tarrare is to erase him. To sensationalize him is to flatten him. To contextualize him requires patience. It requires resisting easy punchlines. And that resistance is difficult in a culture built on speed. Even now, as we examine him, we risk repeating what 18th century crowds did in Lyon marketplaces, gathering around the unusual, staring, measuring. The difference lies in intention. Are we gawking, or are we understanding? Consider how modern media treats extreme cases, medical rarities, unusual conditions, rare syndromes. Some coverage educates, some exploits. The line is thin. Algorithms reward engagement, not empathy, and engagement often spikes with shock. Tarrare's life sits directly at that intersection. He was used by institutions in life. He risks being used by media in memory, which forces a larger question. What responsibility do we carry when telling stories of the unusual? Let's ground ourselves again. Tarrare died in 1798 at approximately 26 years old. Primary accounts stem largely from Pierre-François Percy's later memoirs. No personal writings from Tarrare survive. No self-explanation. His story exists through institutional documentation, military and medical. That alone should temper exaggeration. Because when the subject cannot speak, restraint becomes ethical practice. Historians continue to debate aspects of his case. Was hypothyroidism plausible? Could tuberculosis explain wasting? Was exaggeration layered into early reports? We cannot answer definitively, and that uncertainty is part of the story. So here's what we've uncovered so far. A child born into scarcity, an appetite that destabilized family life, a performer shaped by crowds, a soldier shaped by war, a body studied by medicine, a rumor shaped by fear, a death that raised more questions than it resolved, and a legacy reshaped by every generation that retells it. Tarrare's hunger has ended. Our fascination has not. But before we close this chapter, we need to confront one final dimension. Because Tarrare's life does not only reveal 18th century France, it reveals something enduring about human nature itself. Why are we so drawn to extremes? And what does that say about us? A crowd gathers in a marketplace. Another crowd gathers around a guillotine. Another gathers around a hospital bed. Different settings. Same impulse. We look at what unsettles us. It's late afternoon in Lyon, 1788. You stand in a loose circle of strangers. At the center, a thin young performer consumes food at impossible speed. Some laugh, some recoil, some whisper prayers. No one walks away. Now shift. It's Paris, 1793. A public execution. Crowds again. Eyes fixed. Silence broken by collective gasp. Different spectacle. Same magnetism. Now shift once more. A hospital ward in eastern France. Doctors leaning close, observing Tarrare eat. Measured, documented. But still, watching. The settings change. The motive rarely does. Human beings are drawn to edges, to the boundary between normal and abnormal, order and chaos, control and loss. And Tarrare lived on that boundary. Psychologically, anomaly commands attention. Evolutionarily, we notice what deviates. It may signal danger, novelty, or opportunity. Culturally, societies build rituals around deviation. Public trials, executions, circuses, medical lectures. Each offers controlled exposure to the unfamiliar. In 18th century France, spectacle was communal. You witnessed together, reacted together, judged together. And in revolutionary years, public performance became political language. Authority was demonstrated visibly, justice was displayed, even reform was theatrical. Within that world, Tarrare's body became one more site of collective attention, not because he sought infamy, but because deviation interrupts routine, and interruption draws the eye. A society reveals itself by how it treats the body it cannot explain, but it also reveals itself by why it cannot look away. And here's where it gets complicated. Attention is not neutral. It can humanize or dehumanize. When crowds gathered around Tarrare in Lyon, did they see a struggling teenager or a novelty act? When physicians observed him in hospital, did they see a patient or a specimen? When later readers consumed his story, did they see a young man shaped by revolution and illness, or a headline? Attention without empathy becomes consumption, and consumption, ironically, mirrors the very hunger that defined him. Today, spectacle travels faster than ever. Viral clips of unusual behavior, extreme cases amplified for engagement, comment sections filled with analysis from a distance. We tell ourselves we're curious, but curiosity and entertainment often blur. The 18th century marketplace has become the digital feed. The crowd still gathers. The difference is scale. Tarrare might have trended for weeks, then been forgotten. And that possibility forces an uncomfortable thought. Are we more advanced in knowledge, or simply more efficient in amplification? By the early 1800s, as Percy's account circulated, Tarrare had already become part of medical law. His case was cited as extraordinary, his autopsy described in detail, but no formal medical diagnosis ever solidified. He entered history as unresolved, anomaly. At roughly 26 years old, his life was brief. No family legacy recorded, no memoir, no defense of his own narrative, only the echo of observers. And that asymmetry is part of why we must tread carefully, because when the subject cannot speak, the storyteller carries weight. So where does that leave us 5 chapters after his death? We've explored his childhood, performance years, military experimentation, suspicion, illness, autopsy, and myth. We've seen how revolution shaped his context, how medicine tried to decode him, how memory reshaped him. And now we confront ourselves. Why do we remain captivated? Is it horror, fascination, empathy, all of it? In our next chapter, we step back one final time, not to retell his life, but to sit with its meaning. Because beneath the appetite, beneath the spectacle, beneath the legend, there is a quieter question about control, and about what it means to live inside a body that refuses to obey. Close your eyes. Imagine feeling hunger every hour of every day. Not mild, not passing, relentless. Now imagine living in a century that calls that hunger a moral failure. It's 1792 again. You're standing in the military hospital ward. The light is grey this time, early morning. A ration cart rolls down the aisle. Wooden bowls clatter softly. Men sit up in anticipation. For most of them, this meal will quiet the ache in their stomachs. For Tarrare, it will not. He eats, quickly, efficiently. His expression does not brighten. It does not soften. It barely changes. Moments later, he looks up again, scanning, waiting. You notice something subtle now, something easy to miss when spectacle dominates. He does not look indulgent. He looks trapped. Trapped inside a body that does not register completion. In a century obsessed with discipline, military discipline, moral discipline, revolutionary discipline. Obedience was virtue. Tarrare's body would not obey, and that non-compliance shaped everything. The late 18th century valued control. Control of land, control of grain supply, control of political power, control of narrative. The revolutionary government regulated bread prices through the law of the maximum. It reorganized time through a new calendar. It restructured religion. It executed those seen as threats to order. Control was stability. But the human body does not always conform to social expectation. And when it fails to do so, societies must decide, is this deviation or danger? Tarrare's condition defied categorization. Doctors could not cure it. Officers could not manage it. Peers could not normalize it. He existed as disruption. And institutions are rarely comfortable with disruption. A society reveals itself by how it treats the body it cannot explain. France studied him, used him, suspected him, then set him aside. Not cruelly in theatrical ways, but structurally. And structure can be just as decisive as cruelty. And here's where it becomes most complex. We often imagine control as personal responsibility. Just eat less. Just restrain yourself. But modern neuroscience reminds us that appetite regulation is deeply biochemical. Signals between gut and brain, hormones like leptin and ghrelin, hypothalamic pathways. If those systems malfunction, willpower becomes nearly irrelevant. If Tarrare's hunger stemmed from metabolic dysregulation, then he was not morally weak. He was physiologically overruled. Yet in 1790s France, morality was the only available lens, which means he likely internalized judgment he did not deserve. Imagine carrying both hunger and stigma. The body demands, the culture condemns. There is no safe space between the two. Today, debates around health, weight, and appetite still reveal tension between biology and blame. We speak more openly about hormonal disorders and metabolic syndromes. Yet public discourse often slides back toward moral framing. Self-control is praised. Excess is criticized. Even with advanced science, compassion is uneven. Now imagine navigating that tension without science at all, without vocabulary, without validation. Tarrare's century offered observation without understanding, and understanding without empathy is thin protection. Let's return to the facts. Born around 1772 near Lyon. Forced from home as a teenager due to extreme appetite. Performed in marketplaces during the late 1780s. Joined the French army around 1792. Observed by military surgeon Pierre-François Percy. Used in a failed espionage experiment near the Rhine. Returned ill to Versailles in 1798. Died that same year at approximately 26 years old. Autopsy revealed anatomical abnormalities, but no definitive explanation. Those are the bones of the story. Around them, Interpretation accumulates, but the structure remains: a short life, a relentless appetite, an unanswered question. We've seen how his body resisted obedience, how institutions tried to harness it, how suspicion magnified it, how death failed to clarify it, and how memory reshaped it. At every stage, the tension remains the same: a biological anomaly colliding with a society that required order. The collision produced spectacle, and then silence. In our final chapter, we won't look at what Tarrare consumed. We'll look at what his story reveals about us, about power, about empathy, and about the quiet cost of living as the unexplained. Imagine standing in that hospital ward one last time. The plates are empty. The doctors have gone home. The bed is stripped. Nothing remains but memory. And yet, somehow, the room still feels full. It's 1798, just days after Tarrare's death. You stand in the now quiet ward in Versailles. The window is open slightly. Cold air moves the edge of a curtain. His cot is bare. Another patient will soon take that place. Hospitals do not pause long for reflection. Life replaces life, but you linger, because something about this story refuses to settle. A young man born into scarcity, driven by hunger he did not choose, watched, measured, used, suspected, dissected, and then reduced to paragraphs in a surgeon's memoir. The room is silent now, but the questions echo. History often spotlights kings, generals, revolutions, but sometimes the most revealing stories sit at the margins. Tarrare was not politically powerful. He did not author pamphlets. He did not command troops. Yet his life intersects with nearly every structural force of late 18th century France. Scarcity, war, medical transition, revolutionary paranoia, institutional experimentation. He becomes a lens. Through him, we see how Enlightenment curiosity coexisted with ethical ambiguity, how revolutionary ideals coexisted with instrumental pragmatism, how fascination coexisted with fear. And here is the quiet truth. He exposed the limits of his society's understanding, not because he meant to, but because his body demanded an explanation the era could not provide. A society reveals itself by how it treats the body it cannot explain. France revealed both curiosity and caution, ingenuity and discomfort, documentation and distance. And here's where it becomes personal, because every era believes itself more enlightened than the last. We look back at 1790s medicine and see naivety. We look at revolutionary suspicion and see excess. But what bodies today do we struggle to understand? What behaviors do we still moralize instead of investigate? What anomalies do we turn into spectacle before we extend empathy? We have advanced in science, but the reflex to stare remains. The reflex to categorize remains. The reflex to use what we do not fully comprehend remains. That continuity should humble us. Consider rare medical conditions that still circulate online as viral curiosities. Consider individuals whose differences become trends. We call it awareness. Sometimes it is. Other times, it is repackaged spectacle. The line between education and exploitation is not fixed. It depends on intention, on tone, on context, on whether the subject is treated as human first. Tarrare's story asks us to examine that line, because once someone becomes a headline, their interior life disappears, and his interior life was likely complex, confusing, lonely, driven by sensations we can barely imagine. We return, once more, to the documented facts. Born circa 1772 near Lyon. active as performer in late 1780s, joined the French army around 1792, observed by Pierre-François Percy, used in a failed courier experiment during the War of the First Coalition, fell under suspicion in hospital settings, returned ill to Versailles in 1798, died that same year, approximately age 26. Autopsy noted abnormalities, but no conclusive diagnosis. Everything beyond that, speculation, embellishment, metaphor, rests on interpretation. That restraint matters, because responsible history resists filling silence with fiction. So here is the arc we have travelled. From rural farmhouse to revolutionary battlefield, from marketplace performance to medical manuscript, from hunger as spectacle to hunger as mirror. We began with shock, we moved through context, we arrived at complexity, and now we sit with reflection. Tarrare's appetite was extraordinary, but his humanity was ordinary. He wanted food, relief, perhaps stability. Those are not monstrous desires, they are universal ones. In our final chapter, we will not amplify the strangeness. We will quiet it and ask one final question. What does it mean to live in a body that society cannot explain? And what responsibility does society carry in return? A loaf of bread held high above a crowd, a decree nailed to a wall, a ration weighed on a scale. Power is rarely abstract, it passes through the body. And hunger is one of its sharpest instruments. It's 1793 again. You're standing in a Paris marketplace at dawn. The air is cold enough that your breath fogs. A municipal official stands beside a scale, enforcing price controls under the law of the maximum. Grain merchants wait nervously. Women in line clutch coins tightly. Bread is measured, distributed, watched. You feel how political this moment is. This is not just food. This is authority made tangible. Now shift your perspective. In a military ward hundreds of miles away, Tarrare consumes more than regulation allows. His appetite ignores policy. It bypasses ration logic. It disrupts calculation. In a nation where bread equals stability, his body becomes an unsolvable equation. And that is what makes his story more than medical curiosity. Revolutionary France tried to regulate hunger, price ceilings, grain requisitions, punishment for hoarding. The state understood that food, scarcity fueled unrest, control supply, control stability. But hunger cannot be legislated away. It can be managed, redistributed, mitigated, never erased. Tarrare embodied that truth at an individual scale. His appetite ignored systems. Doctors could not reduce it. Officers could not discipline it. Hospitals could not cure it. He represented a form of internal disorder in a period obsessed with external order. A society reveals itself by how it treats the body it cannot explain. France's response was practical. Observe it, test it, attempt to use it. When utility faded, distance it. Not uniquely cruel, not uniquely compassionate, simply structured. And structure, in times of upheaval, often prioritizes stability over nuance. And here's where the tension sharpens. Revolutions promise liberation, but liberation requires management. New governments must feed citizens. Armies must feed soldiers. Cities must feed crowds. The state's authority depends on satisfying basic needs. Tarrare's existence disrupted the math. He consumed more than allotted. He resisted satisfaction. He made visible the fragility of ration systems, not symbolically, physically. And that visibility unsettles power. Even today, governments wrestle with food security, supply chains, inflation, rationing in crisis zones. Public trust rises and falls with grocery prices. The relationship between hunger and political stability has not disappeared. It has only scaled. Now imagine a modern institution confronting a biological anomaly it cannot immediately explain. There would be committees, funding proposals, clinical trials. But beneath all that would remain the same instinct: stabilize the variable, make the unpredictable predictable. Tarrare was a variable who resisted stabilization, and systems do not love variables. The law of the maximum was enacted in 1793 to cap prices on essential goods, including grain. Violations could lead to severe punishment. Food distribution was monitored intensely. Simultaneously, France fought wars on multiple fronts. Supply lines were strained. In this context, Tarrare's documented consumption of multiple soldiers' rations was not trivial. It was disruptive. That disruption is why he drew medical and military attention, not merely because he was strange, but because he existed inside a tightly regulated ecosystem, and ecosystems react to imbalance. We've traced hunger from farmhouse to battlefield, from spectacle to state policy, from biological compulsion to political metaphor. Tarrare's appetite was extreme, but the society around him was also extreme. In its upheaval, its ambition, its restructuring of power, both operated in states of intensity. Both struggled to find equilibrium, and neither fully succeeded. Only 2 chapters remain. In the next, we will sit not with systems, but with silence, because when the spectacle fades and the policies dissolve, what lingers is something simpler: a life that burned briefly, and a question that outlived it. No crowd, no hospital ward, no marketplace, just wind moving across an empty field outside Lyon. The story's over. It's early morning in the French countryside. Not 1798, not 1793, just a field. Low mist clings to the grass. Wheat bends gently in the wind. You stand alone. There is no spectacle here, no doctors taking notes, no officers drafting plans, no crowd waiting to gasp, just land. This is the kind of landscape into which Tarrare was born around 1772. Quiet, ordinary, unremarkable. And that contrast is striking, because when we tell his story, we often focus on its strangeness, but his life began and ended in ordinary human rhythms: birth, family strain, work, war, illness, death. The extraordinary sat inside the ordinary, as it often does, but the feeling remains, because power prefers predictability. It is about power meeting biology and failing to fully contain it. When we zoom out, Tarrare's life spans a period of immense transformation. Born under the Ancien Regime, adolescent during pre-revolutionary unrest, adult during war and political upheaval, dead before Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804. He lived only 26 years, yet those years intersected with seismic change. And still, history remembers him not for ideology, not for allegiance, but for appetite, which raises a subtle question. Why do some lives become symbolic while others vanish? Part of the answer is anomaly. History records what disrupts expectation. A soldier who eats normally is forgotten. A soldier who consumes 10 rations becomes documentation. But anomaly does not erase humanity. It simply reframes it. A society reveals itself by how it treats the body it cannot explain. But history reveals itself by which bodies it chooses to remember. And here's the tension that lingers. We can analyze the politics. We can speculate about diagnoses. We can critique the ethics of experimentation. but we cannot reconstruct his interior experience. We do not know what it felt like to wake each day hungry, to be watched while eating, to be suspected when something went wrong, to return to a doctor fearing death at 26. Silence surrounds those moments, and responsible history does not fill silence with fiction. It leaves space for humility, space for restraint. In our era, documentation is constant. Photos, videos, messages, digital footprints. Future historians will know far more about individual interior lives. But that abundance brings its own distortion. We curate our identities. We perform for audiences. Even today, how much of what we see is authentic experience versus projected narrative? Tarrare left no curated record, only observation. In a way, his story is purer and more fragile because it depends entirely on how carefully we handle it. Let us return one final time to the documented outline. Born circa 1772 near Lyon, extreme appetite noted in youth, performed publicly in late 1780s, joined French army during War of the First Coalition, observed by surgeon Pierre-François Percy, used in an experimental courier mission, fell under suspicion in hospital settings, returned ill to Versailles in 1798, died that year at approximately age 26. Autopsy described abnormalities, but no definitive diagnosis. These facts form the stable core. Everything else, interpretation, metaphor, cultural meaning, rests on them, and they are enough. We began with shock. A man who ate more than seemed possible. We traced his life through poverty, performance, war, medicine, suspicion, illness, and memory. We explored revolution, scarcity, and power. We examined psychology and spectacle. Now we are left not with mystery solved, but mystery respected. And sometimes that is the most honest ending history can offer. One final chapter remains, not to add new facts, but to gather everything we've learned and turn the lens fully toward ourselves, because the final question is not about Tarrare's hunger, it is about ours. A young man sits at a wooden table in 1792. A phone screen glows in your hand in 2026. Two different centuries. One shared impulse. We lean toward what unsettles us. It's late at night. You're alone. The room is quiet except for the faint hum of electricity. You've just spent hours walking through 18th century France, through wheat fields, hospital wards, military corridors, candlelit studies. Now you're back, but something lingers. Imagine Tarrare again, not devouring a spectacle meal, not swallowing a wooden box, not lying on an autopsy table, just sitting, hungry, confused, perhaps embarrassed, perhaps resigned. There is no crowd now, no doctors, no officers, just a young man inside a body that will not quiet itself. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Every society encounters bodies it cannot explain, and every society must decide what to do next. We've examined scarcity, revolution, and medical transition. We've traced how Tarrare's life intersected with rural poverty, the pre-revolutionary food crisis, the War of the First Coalition, the Reign of Terror, the experimental edge of Enlightenment medicine. He lived at a hinge point in history, but his story is not unique in structure. It follows a familiar arc. Anomaly appears, crowds gather, institutions intervene, curiosity blends with utility, fear enters, the anomaly fades, the story remains. That arc repeats across centuries, not just in medicine, in politics, in culture, in media. A society reveals itself by how it treats the body it cannot explain. France in the 1790s revealed ingenuity, impatience, fascination, and structural pragmatism. Not monstrous, not enlightened, human. And here's where the lens turns fully toward us. Today, we have advanced diagnostics, genetic testing, endocrinology, neuroscience. We understand appetite regulation in ways Percy could not imagine. And yet, we still turn anomaly into headline. We still circulate the unusual. We still oscillate between empathy and entertainment. We are better informed, but we are not immune to the pull of spectacle. That pull is ancient. It drew crowds in Lyon. It drew doctors to a hospital bed. It draws viewers to stories like this. The difference lies not in whether we look, but in how we look. If Tarrare lived today, he would likely be examined by specialists, perhaps treated, perhaps diagnosed, perhaps supported. But he might also trend. He might appear in documentaries, interviews, viral posts. We cannot pretend modernity erased spectacle. It refined it, scaled it, monetized it. The responsibility then shifts to the storyteller, to the viewer, to the culture consuming the narrative. Are we here for shock or for understanding? That distinction shapes everything. He died in 1798, approximately 26 years old. No known grave marker that attracts pilgrimage, no monument, no statue, only medical notes preserved in memoir. And yet, more than 2 centuries later, his name still circulates. Not because he conquered territory, not because he drafted constitutions, but because his body disrupted expectation. History often preserves disruption. The quiet majority fade. The anomalies linger. We began in a military ward in 1792. We moved backward to a rural childhood near Lyon. We watched him perform in marketplaces. We followed him into Revolutionary War. We saw doctors measure, test, speculate. We witnessed suspicion darken his surroundings. We stood beside his autopsy table. We traced how his story transformed into legend. And now we end not with certainty, but with perspective. Tarrare was not a monster, not a myth, not a metaphor. He was a young man born into scarcity, living through revolution, navigating a body that refused to align with the expectations of his time. His hunger was real. So was his humanity. If this story stayed with you, let it stay for the right reasons, not for shock, but for what it reveals about curiosity, power, and empathy. History is not only about empires and battles. It is also about the individuals who fall through the gaps of understanding. If you found value in this slow journey through 18th century France, consider liking and subscribing. It helps sustain long-form history that favors depth over noise. And I'd love to ask you one final question. When you encounter something or someone that unsettles your expectations, do you lean in to understand, or do you lean in to consume? Our next long-form documentary will explore another overlooked historical life, one shaped not by hunger of the body, but by hunger for belief. Until then, stay curious and look carefully, because sometimes the most revealing stories are the ones history struggled to explain.